During the Napoleonic Wars, many European countries were united in the fight against the French. Several coalitions were formed, and during all this period, one country, Russia, was a very powerful state who joined the coalitions on several occasions. Thanks to the expansion of the Russian army, we can recreate the battles fought between the French and the Russians during this period using the Commands and Colors Napoleonics system. Hello, this is Michel Leviathan-Sorbet, and this is a new episode of Wojennik TV. Today I would like to invite you to yet another trip to the Commands and Colors Napoleonics series. I would like to present you the review of one of the important expansions for this system. An expansion which I have already showed you during an unboxing and during also a playthrough presented in Polish. This will be the review of the second expansion in the whole series, Commands and Colors Napoleonics, the Russian Army. The Russian Army is the second official expansion after the Spanish Army, but it was launched on the P500 list alongside its Austrian and Prussian sisters or brothers. All the three expansions were gathering additional orders, and GMT Games declared that the expansion which receives the most orders up to some date will be released as the first one. And the Russian army received the biggest number of orders, then it was the Austrians and finally the Prussians. Obviously all three were released, but the Russian army received number 2 in the order of the expansions, and so it became the second expansion in the whole series. The Russian army is obviously focused on the Russians during the Napoleonic Wars, and the Russians were a really powerful force to be reckoned with during the whole Napoleonic Wars. They fought the French on several occasions during several of the coalitions formed against the French, and it was finally the Russian campaign which proved to be the downfall of Napoleon. So the impact of the Russians, of the Russian army fighting the French during the Napoleonic Wars was something extremely important. Thanks to this expansion, which includes not less than 20 scenarios, we can recreate both the smaller as well as the bigger battles fought between the two sides during this whole period. In the expansion, we will find not only new scenarios, but also new units specific to the Russians, new rules, new terrain tiles, a lot of interesting features. The expansion, as well as the core game, was designed by Richard Borg and released by GMT Games in 2013. This is a game for 2 players, but if you have several copies of the game or expansions allowing to play in a bigger group, you can play it also, for instance, in a group of 4, 6, even 8 players. The time of play will depend on the scenario. In the case of smaller engagements, you can play a game in 45 to 60 minutes. In the case of bigger engagements, you will be fighting up to 2 or 3 hours. The minimum age of the player is 14 years or higher, and this is a scenario. This is a standalone. This is not a standalone box, which means that in order to play, you have to possess also you have to own also the basic game. Now, without further ado, I'd like to invite you to the middle part of the video, during which I'd like to present you yet one more time this expansion, show you what are its components, explain what are the new mechanics added, and in the end, in the final part of this video, I would like to share with you my final thoughts concerning this expansion and to briefly point out the strong but also the weaker points of this design. Here is a brief look at Commands and Colors Napoleonics, the Russian Army. The Russian Army is yet another expansion for the Commands and Colors Napoleonics series, which, as the title suggests, adds the Russian Army to the whole Commands and Colors Napoleonics universe.
Now, this is obviously an expansion focused on the Russian army, which fought the French on numerous occasions and during several of the coalitions which were created to oppose the French Empire and to oppose the French hegemony in Europe. This is an expansion which enables us to create battles both from 1806, from 1807, as well as later from 1812 and even from 1814 during the French campaign. Not less than 20 different scenarios are part of this expansion, and among those scenarios you can find big ones such as battles of Borodino in several scenarios in which we have the Utitsa, in which we have the Rajewski redoubt section, in which we can fight also the part concerning the village of Borodino or maybe the Shevardino redoubt. As you can see, those are huge battles in which we will be fighting to accumulate not less than 10 victory banners. In general, most of the scenarios which are part of this expansion are big ones in which we have really numerous units, in which we have to attain really a lot of banners in order to win. But we have also smaller engagements, especially during the 1806 or 1807 campaign, where we have, for instance, the Battle of Morungen, where we have several scenarios concerning the Battle of Eylau, but we have also Gołymin and Pultusk, the two battles fought during Christmas on 1806. We have the Battle of Chardowo, which is the first in the expansion, but as I mentioned also, we have 3 battles fought in 1814 during the French campaign, starting from Champaubert on 10th February 1814. This is the most unbalanced scenario of the whole expansion and the most unbalanced scenario of the whole series, in which the French forces have absolutely no problems in destroying, literally annihilating all the Russian forces defending south of the Champaubert village. But we have also the Battle of Montmirail, a little bit more interesting, and especially the Battle of Craonne, which is a big battle fought in the first week of March 1814, in which we will be fighting for not less than 10 banners. This expansion adds Russian units, and among those units we have different kinds of them. We have line infantry, we have light infantry, and what's interesting is that infantry units, both line and light infantry Russian units, are composed only of 3 blocks, which is significantly less, which is less than when it comes to other nations which have 4 blocks per unit. But those units are more sturdy, which means that those units can ignore one flag if such a unit has to retreat. So they have less blocks, but at the same time they are more resilient. They do not have to escape and they do not have to retreat as often as other nations. We have some interesting units, for instance, the Russian Guard Light Infantry units, which is another type of light infantry possessed by the Russians. We have also, for instance, Russian Guard Grenadier Infantry. We have several kinds of cavalry units. Among them, very interesting ones are the Russian Guard Heavy Cavalry. Just take a look at it. 8 blocks per unit, 6 blocks per unit. Those are real monsters, which are heavy cavalry, so they will benefit also from 1 additional die in melee, which means that they are extremely dangerous. They can just destroy almost every unit in a single attack. We have also the Russian Light Cossack Cavalry, which is extremely climatic, extremely interesting. This is a unit which is a very fast unit. As you can see, it can move up to 3 hexes. It has only 2 blocks in a unit. Additionally, it doesn't score any hits on sabers rolled, but it can ignore forest terrain, melee combat dice reduction, and additionally, when such a unit is eliminated, it doesn't count as a victory banner for your opponent, which is a significant advantage because it means that such a unit can be sent to dangerous parts of the battlefield where we want, for instance, to block an enemy unit or maybe to score an easy hit in order to destroy a unit which is only composed of 1 block, which is all that is left from a unit which was hit earlier by other units. Now in this expansion, we receive also one interesting additional mechanic, which is the pre-battle Mother Roll, Russia Mother Roll. So we have this mechanic, the pre-battle Mother Russia roll, which works in such a way that the Russian player, if the scenario explicitly states that this rule is in effect during such a battle, before the battle starts, rolls a number of dice equal to its command rating, for instance 5. And depending on the results obtained, he can receive a benefit, a bonus before the battle starts. If he rolls an infantry symbol, he can add an additional block to a line infantry unit on the battlefield, bringing it to 4 blocks, and additionally he will add also a special paper strength counter to such a unit, indicating that this unit is bigger and stronger than standard line infantry units, which means also that during the battle, if such a unit takes casualties, it can be rallied up to its maximum of 4 blocks per unit. The same rule will apply to artillery, which normally is composed only of 3 blocks per unit, but if the Russian player rolls also an artillery roll during his pre-battle roll, he can bring such a unit to paper strength and augment the number of blocks in such a unit to 4. If he rolls any cavalry unit, it enables him to bring additional Cossack units onto the battlefield. He chooses where to place them, he adds such a unit next to his own units, and he can use them during this battle. Sabers permits the Russian player to add additional fieldworks to the battlefield, because in this expansion, due to the fact that many of the battles were defensive ones, fought defensively from the Russian perspective, we have a lot of fieldworks of different types, and the Russian player can add such fieldworks in order to reinforce his position and to make them more difficult to capture by the French player, Finally, if we roll a flag, the Russian player can reinforce a light infantry unit, also bringing it to paper strength, or he can choose from among all the other options. So he can, for instance, also bring a Cossack unit or reinforce an artillery or line infantry unit. It's up to him. So that's an interesting mechanic, although it works only once during a game, at the start of the game, and only if the specific scenario specifically indicates that it is in effect, because in some scenarios this rule will not be in effect. Additionally, due to the terrain feature in some of the battles, we have additional terrain tiles added to this expansion, so we receive additional terrain tiles in form of a church, we have marshes, we have lakes, we have also frozen lakes, we have also special fieldworks, both 4-sided as well as 2-sided, which will be used for several of the scenarios, especially for the scenarios related to the Borodino battles, where a lot of fieldworks were in use during the whole battle. And that's pretty it when it comes to what we can find in this expansion, what are the specifics related to the units or to the scenarios. Now I'd like to invite you to the last part of this video, during which I'd like to share with you my final thoughts concerning this expansion. I'd like to compare the Russians to other nations which I have already presented on Wojennik TV, so the British, the Spanish, and I would like to give you a final judgment concerning, is this an interesting expansion, is it worth acquiring, and are the Russians really an equal opponent to the French?
As you all know, Commands and Colors Napoleonics is one of my favorite games. During my childhood, I dreamt of playing a game which would enable me to recreate the whole period of the Napoleonic Wars, the epic battles fought between the French and the different nations forming the several coalitions which were formed during this period against the French. And Commands and Colors Napoleonics is a game which fulfilled this dream, which was something which I was really anxious to play. I backed the game instantly when I received the information that it was included on the P500 list, and when I got it, I played it really for a long time. It was more than 10 years ago, but still I like this system, I like to return to this game, and I like to play also the scenarios which are part of the several additional expansions released through the years. Obviously, I own them all. The Russian army was the second expansion, and I was anxious to receive it, I was anxious to play it, because I was fully aware of the impact of the Russians on the outcome of the Napoleonic Wars. of their importance during the several campaigns, during the several coalitions formed against the French. So the epic battles of Borodino, Mało-Jarosławiec, of their impact on battles fought during the 1806-1807 campaign, so Gołymin, Półtusk, Friedland, Eylau, those were all big important engagements, and I was really eager to play those scenarios. And I must say that the Russian army is an interesting addition to the whole series, but there are also some elements which in my opinion can be problematic. As always, I will start by what I like in this expansion and what I think are the strong points of this title. So firstly, I'd like to tell you a few words about the quality of what we receive in this box. Now, the quality of the whole series, as you all know, is really high. We receive in the base game a study map, we receive great quality blocks, great stickers, we receive interesting scenarios, a well-written scenario book and rule book. So those are the elements which are really good. In the Russian expansion, we receive all of that. So we receive, apart from the playing board, we receive additional elements such as new blocks, which are green blocks, which are really which are nice in terms of how they look, but at the same time I have a personal feeling that they, when presented when put on the board and when opposed to the French, sometimes might be quite comparable. I suppose that it's related to the uniforms which are presented on the stickers, but still I have a feeling that maybe a little bit different green color should have been used. But still, not a big problem, it's only my personal, it's only the way how I perceive it personally. Additionally, the stickers, as I said earlier, the uniforms, the forms, the different depictions of the Russian soldiers are really terrific. I really like them, they are dynamic, they are very pretty, they are really interesting, and they make the Russian army then presented on the board really look great. The problem is related to the additional terrain tiles, but I will be speaking about it in a few moments. But apart from that, we must underline that in this expansion we receive not less than 20 scenarios. Now, if we compare it to the core game, we receive 5 more scenarios, because in the core game we received only 15 of them. So instantly we see that the number of battles that we can fight is significantly higher than in the base game. But that's not all, because apart from the number, about the quantity, we receive also a very different approach concerning quality, the scale of those scenarios. Now, if we return once more to the base game, we can see that the biggest battle included in the base game is Waterloo, in which we have only 9 banners to be gathered by each of the sides. In the Russian army, we receive not less than 5 scenarios, so 25% of them all, in which we have to gather 10 banners, which means that the scale of the scenarios included in this expansion is significantly higher than in what we received in the base game. Now, this is an interesting and good approach, because the base game is supposed also to teach you the system, to make you feel comfortable with all the mechanics. The Russian army is supposed to enhance this experience, is supposed to give you an additional grasp on over mechanics, maybe on over elements, and on over bigger battles. And this is a good approach, but still I'm very, very happy that this expansion is also targeting the players who are looking for bigger battles, for bigger engagements, longer games in which we really have to focus more on maneuvers, on combined attacks, on how to outmaneuver our opponent, on exploiting his weaknesses, on repositioning our forces, on rallying our forces. There will be a lot of more interesting things than only pushing forward our troops, shooting at them, engaging in melee, gathering 5 banners, ending the game, and maybe switching sides. Here the battles will be significantly longer, and I really like it, because I like longer games, I like bigger engagements in which this roller coaster of gathering, of getting additional banners and attacking, defending will be significantly more felt than in the base game. Then we have also new mechanics, new units, new hex types, new hexes added. So this expansion adds not only new scenarios, but obviously new units, because we receive a new nation, but also new terrain tiles, also new mechanics. Related to the units, the Russian army was a very specific one, and the designer and GMT Games tried to include those historical flavor of the Russian army, 18th century army still at the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars, into the final game. So the Russian army is less numerous than its French counterpart. Infantry units are composed only of 3 blocks, unless they receive an additional paper strength block due to the specific mechanic, which is the pre-battle Mother Russia roll. Now this seems to be historical because the Russians had problems with mobilizing their troops and they very often engaged their enemies, started campaigns under strength, so without fully mobilizing their troops and having smaller units. Again, one additional factor is the fact that even though their numerical inferiority in some cases, they still stood ground and they fought very bitterly to the bitter end. So they can avoid one flag result. Their morale is extremely high. They are very disciplined. They were also eager to fight against fieldworks, against different types of fortifications or entrenchments or over trenches or over fieldworks. So we receive a lot of fieldwork tiles, which we will be using during the several scenarios. We will receive additional rules concerning, for instance, temporary victory banners due to the control of specific spaces in scenarios. So there are some specific elements related to the Russian army which were included in the expansion in order to give you this flavor, this specific feel of controlling an army, very different from the others which we receive in the entire series. And this works well, although it also makes the Russians very specific in terms of how you should use them and very vulnerable to frontal attacks. I will get to this in some time. Finally, what I really like in this expansion is also the fact that the units which are included in this expansion are very interesting and very diverse. I already said that we have specific infantry units, but that's not all. We receive also a lot of different cavalry units, among them the special guard unit, the cavalry unit, which is composed of not less than 6 blocks, additionally receiving 1 more die during melee attacks. So it's a real monster. It's one of the most powerful units in the entire game, and using it to its full potential can make the game instantly change from one side to another, and it can enable the annihilation of every unit in the game during a single attack. That's such a powerful unit that you really have to very carefully use it, and when used at a very specific time in a good way, you can really achieve wonders using it. So it's a really, really good unit. Then you will receive also Cossack units, which can be both used from the start of the scenario if you happen to have any in the original scenario setup, or you can add those units using the pre-battle Mother Russia roll if you roll some cavalry symbols. And Cossacks are also an extremely interesting unit. They seem extremely weak. Not only 2 blocks in a unit. They do not roll hits while rolling. They do not inflict hits while rolling sabers, but still they have also an extremely huge potential because they are not worth any victory point to their opponent. So you can use them to hunt down enemy single block units in order to gather banners. You can block the retreat path of units which will be attacked from the front. You can sacrifice them in different ways in order to hinder your opponent to gain an advantage, because you do not care. Your opponent, even when destroying this unit, will not receive any banners, which is something which gives this unit a huge potential, which makes it also quite unique in the whole series. I like this unit. It's one of the most interesting in the whole expansion. So the Russian army is really an interesting mix of very powerful, very interesting, and at the same time very, very vulnerable units. You really have to know how to play them. This is an expansion which is not an expansion for beginners, because playing the Russians will be quite challenging, will be quite difficult. Not only the game will be quite long if you are playing a big scenario, but at the same time playing the Russians and using their strong point, their strong potential, the strong defensive potential, and exploiting enemy weaknesses, counterattacking at the right time, using the stronger units in order to counterattack or to attack locally, is quite difficult for beginners. So this is not an expansion which should be used when playing against beginners, unless you are using some smaller scenarios or some less complicated, like Champaubert, which I will be referring and returning to in a few moments. So, concluding this part, I think that this is an interesting expansion which is climatic, is historic, but at the same time it gives you also a lot of decisions to make. It requires you to well know what are the weaknesses and strong points of this army in order to play it correctly, in order to have a chance in repulsing the numerous French attacks during most of the scenarios. The weaker points of this scenario will be as follows. Firstly, the terrain tiles. I already said that the quality of the elements of the base game of the whole series is quite high. This is somewhat a deluxe game from the beginning, with a sturdy map, with great artwork, with great blocks, etc. But the quality of the tiles from the beginning was a problem. They are so thin that sometimes it's even difficult to grab them and to place them or to displace them on the board. So I believe that the quality of those tiles should have been better. They should have been not that thick that they are, and this is the only problem concerning the quality of what we receive in the expansion. The second thing is that, as I said earlier, the Russian army is a very specific one, and you might think that on paper the idea of reducing the number of blocks in a unit but at the same time granting them the ability to avoid a banner will work. But in reality it is not the case. This is an extremely weak unit, a unit which will lose blocks very rapidly and which can be eliminated very rapidly, which means that it can grant your opponent a banner very rapidly. Because if you happen to be attacked by a French unit composed of 4 blocks and you receive 2 hits, you are reduced to 1 block. What a single block can do? Not a lot of things. It can remain on the hex which it occupied using its special national capacity, but why should such a unit stay in place? It will be very rapidly eliminated, your opponent will score a banner. So the infantry units, unless reinforced thanks to the pre-battle modern Russia role, will be extremely weak, even in fieldworks, which makes the Russian army very vulnerable, and at some times it will make you wonder how to even try to score victory points using this army. So using artillery units, using your quite strong cavalry will be key elements, and understanding what are your strong points, understanding what are your weak points will be key to victory. The Russian army is not a weak army. It's not an army which is unmanageable. You cannot think of it as an army which cannot be used to score very impressive victories, because you can win very important victories, especially defensive ones, but still it's quite difficult because you have to know how to exploit its strong points. The second thing, which in my opinion is a problem, is the fact that when you look at the scenarios, you receive not less than 20 of them. But then when you look, for instance, at a scenario like Champaubert, you might think what the designer and what the testers thought of when deciding to publish the scenario as it was published. Because this is such a one-sided scenario that I will risk the opinion that this is the least balanced scenario in the whole series. And now I understand that in history Champaubert was a one-sided engagement in which the French just destroyed and annihilated the whole of Soviet's core. But still, this is a game. This is not only a historical simulation. You can create very detailed historical simulations. You can release products which will be extremely historically accurate, but if they are not challenging to the players, if they do not give even a small chance of winning to one of the sides, what's the purpose of playing? And I believe that Champaubert is a classical example of being too much historically accurate and too less of a game. you should consider creating this scenario in another way. During my playthrough, which is unfortunately only in Polish, I presented several ideas how to make this scenario more challenging for the French and how to balance it more in order to make it more playable. You can think of ideas such as maybe granting the Russians additional banners if they manage to retreat through their hex side. You can include a timer which would force the French to score a certain amount of banners during a given time period, which would be historically accurate because Ossufiev thought that he can be reinforced by Russians and Prussians in the area in order to repulse the French attack. You can think of maybe scoring additional victory points for the Russians for inflicted hits in terms of not only eliminated units but blocks eliminated, because the French scored a significant victory destroying Ossufiev courts and they had very, very small losses, 600 or 650 men if I recall correctly. So you can count the number of eliminated blocks on each side at the end of the battle, and if the French lost significantly more troops in terms of blocks, you can still consider it a Russian victory. So there is a lot of options, there are a lot of interesting ideas that could have been included in this scenario, but we received a non-balanced, not balanced, very one-sided scenario, which is quite boring to play from the Russian perspective. And I understand that it's historical, but still I would expect something more from a game, because that's not only a historical simulation, but it's rather a game in which I would like to enjoy it playing from both perspectives. And Champ-Aubert is, in my opinion, a classical example of a scenario just added to the game without really thinking how it should work in order to give it satisfaction to both sides, because now it's such unbalance that the Russians have only an illusionary chance of winning. Having said all that, I still believe that the Russian army is an extremely interesting addition to the whole series. The Russians had to be there, and they are here. They are an interesting army, an army composed of very strong but at the same time of weak units, or of units which have their strengths but also their weaknesses, which has to be managed in a very careful way, because the vulnerability of the Russian infantry makes it quite easy to be attacked and easily destroyed. You have to keep reserves, you have to keep artillery units, and you have to use also your cavalry to keep enemy forces at bay. If you do, you can score interesting victories using defensive strategy and counterattacking at the opportune moment. If you do, you will win and you will enjoy this expansion. But still, I think that it's not an expansion which should be used with beginners. You should start by the core game and then maybe expanding using other expansions such as the Russian army, which is, as I already underlined a few times, an interesting addition, especially if you're searching for more complicated battles in which you have to gather more banners than in the core game. This was the review of the Russian army, an expansion for the Commands and Colors Napoleonic series. Thank you a lot for watching it. I invite you also to take a look at my other videos. Take also a look at my Facebook and my Instagram accounts. Have a great day and see you next time.